I'm going to be your MC for today, though Tulsee obviously will be doing most of the talking. Just to provide some quick context, if about a month ago, Brooke Scott came in, gave us a really amazing all hands presentation on DEI, how we can be better allies. And sort of during his presentation, he kind of told it, he ran an exercise with us. He asked us all to do a Google image search on cute babies. And many of us were surprised at the results and how we saw very few babies of color. And as a follow-up, Asif offered to reach out into his network to see if we could do a lunch and learn to give a talk on machine learning fairness and AI ethics. And now we have this lunch and learn. And so I would love to introduce Tulsee. Tulsee is the product lead for Google's machine learning fairness and responsible AI efforts, where she leads the development of Google-wide improvements, resources, and best practices for developing more inclusive, diverse, and ethical products. Previously to this role, Tulsee worked on the YouTube recommendations team. And just to show off for Tulsee a bit, Tulsee was recognized last year by Lighthouse 3 as one of the top 100 women in AI ethics. And Asif has really had the pleasure to work closely with Tulsee over in his past career, and he truly believes that she is one of the leading minds driving responsible AI. So with that introduction, Tulsee, please take away the microphone. We're so happy to have you here at Handshake, and thank you for doing this talk.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Robin, for that very nice introduction. And I actually had the pleasure of working very closely with Asif on issues of image search and how do we think about diversity for queries like cute babies. And that's obviously something that we're continuing to try and make better and make sure that we're doing better for. So what I'll do is I have a set of slides. I am using the web version of Zoom, and so I don't get to see hand raises, unfortunately. But if you have a question, feel free to interrupt, just drop something in the chat. I want this to be a little bit more of a dialogue than just me talking at you for an hour. Although I can talk at you for an hour if that would be preferred. So please do interrupt. You can jump in, add something. We can take the dialogue in multiple different ways, especially since I know different people have been seeing different aspects of Google from a DEI perspective, certain experiences that you may have had yourself with Google products. So we'll go from there. Perfect. Thanks, Robin. Awesome. So what I'm going to do, though, is take a step a little bit farther back from specific products and talk more about what do we mean when we talk about ML fairness? What does it mean to build a fair product experience? And what are some of the lessons that we've learned in the process of trying to do so? So with that, let's get started. So before I jump in, I'm going to start with a case study. And this is actually just a broader sort of case study from what we've seen happening in the real world. But let's start with this case study of predicting sentencing. So one of the things that is happening more commonly as machine learning systems become more popular is using machine learning and AI systems for a wide variety of real world tasks, including the justice system and predicting whether or not someone should be released early from prison, whether someone is actually guilty based on the information provided. And one of the examples here is two petty theft arrests. One was a man named Vernon Prater, and one was a woman named Brisha Borden. And they were given risk scores, the assumption being, what is the likelihood of this individual to recommit a crime if we were to release them early from prison? Prater, who is white, was rated low risk for a future crime after shoplifting, despite the fact that he was a seasoned criminal, 2 armed robberies, 1 attempted armed robbery. Borden, who is black, was rated high risk with a score of 8 for future crime after she and a friend took and then returned before the police arrived a kid's bike and scooter that were sitting outside, right? 2 years later, Borden has not been charged with any new crimes. Prater is serving an 8-year prison term for grand theft. And the reason I think this example is so powerful, as I'm sure you're seeing through even the examples of their crimes, is just what an AI system, when built incorrectly, when built with bias, can actually do for someone's life, right? This is a question of whether you're actually spending time in prison, whether it's your livelihood, it's your quality of life, it's your self-worth, it's your existence overall, it's the way that the system works for you. And the single decision by an AI system can dramatically change that choice. Another example that I think is like particularly concerning here is the idea of predicting criminality. So in fact, a paper released, I think in 2016, claimed that just based on looking at faces and based on looking at learning using machine learning from your face, that they could predict whether or not you were likely to be a criminal, right? Just from your face alone, just based on the images. And they collected a bunch of data and showed that they could do this automatic inference. And of course, like hugely problematic, right? Because it is not the case that a face can tell you that kind of information. There's so much else that is at stake. And again, what does that mean for the kind of biases that you're building into a system? And so both of these are slightly alarming cases, but are true cases and true stories of the way that machine learning can be used in real life consequences, and why thinking about fairness and bias when we're building these systems is so critical. But when we're even just thinking about products that are, more innocuous and more day-to-day than the broader ML kind of use cases in these high stakes, high risk situations, these concerns still come through. They still permeate through. The image search example that you talked about is one of them in terms of the way that they affect our experiences, the way they allow us to be a part of a particular experience, the way they frame our own views into what is appropriate, what is beautiful, what is cute, all become affected based on these systems. And so, AI is being used everywhere around the world. Justice systems are one of these examples. Phrenology, as problematic as it is another. There's also a really great set of use cases that AI is being used for in terms of climate change, in terms of detecting and supporting diabetes diagnoses, in terms of thinking about forestation and better predicting areas of opportunity, in terms of thinking about robotics and also what we're sending up to the moon, right? There's a number of cases in which AI is actually providing these amazing experiences. It's also just being used in every single Google product, right? So whether that's the assistant and the conversations you have with your home devices, whether that is search and query ranking, whether that is YouTube and recommendations, quick access in Google Drive, Street View images and maps, AI has become a consistent part of all of our product experiences that we often don't even think about. We just exist and do and participate in on a daily basis. So when we think about those experiences, what is ML fairness? How does it permeate through those products, and how do we think about it? One of the things we've done for our products is set up the AI principles. And this is a set of 7 principles that are things that we want to think about when we're building AI. And then 4 principles of applications that we are explicitly not going to pursue using the machine learning systems that we build. And the second one of these is avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. And so a lot of what I've spent my time doing over the last few years has been working with each of those Google products I just showed on the last slide to ask questions of, what does it mean to have unfair bias in our product? How do we define that exactly? And what makes AI uniquely positioned in this conversation, and how do we think about the effect that it might have? So before I go into then the AI question, I think the first question is like, what does it mean to actually have a fair product experience, and how do those experiences get built? And part of, I think, that journey is also recognizing the fact that humans actually have a history of making product design decisions that are not in line with the needs of everyone. And for those of you, working on Handshake and multiple product experiences within that ecosystem, I think it's something we want to think about independent of machine learning, right? For example, female drivers were 47% more likely to be severely injured in an auto accident because female body type crash test dummies weren't required by the US Department of Transportation until 2011. So until 2011, not for any particular malintent, most car manufacturers were testing seatbelts on a single type of crash test dummy. And if you're doing that, you're not likely to recognize or understand how different body types might react differently and the kind of injuries that could cause. Not an ML example, but an example of new technology. And when building that out, we can have these oversights in terms of wanting to test an MVP, wanting to build something quickly, wanting to have a quick QA check that we sort of acknowledge as being available for everyone. Another example, not even technological, is the Band-Aid. So I really love this tweet that I found a couple years ago where someone says how important it was and what an amazing experience it was to finally use a Band-Aid that actually matched their own skin color. And it's funny because I had never even realized that Band-Aids were meant to be matching your skin color. And that was actually part of the way that they had been designed and colored in the first place. And so to again see what it means when we make these kinds of decisions in an initial experience in order to make something work for the majority audience, and then not even realize what that could be doing downstream and the kind of impact it can have when we start thinking about what it looks like to make product experiences really see everyone, right? Because product inclusion really at the end of the day is about everyone feeling seen and feeling heard, and like their experience and their voice actually matters. And the thing is these are all like not necessarily malintentioned activities, right? This is not people trying to create poor experiences for certain users or for certain types of things. It's about making obvious choices, right? Making a choice that makes sense, getting something out the door. When we talk about V0s and MVPs and a smaller set of users that we want to serve, we often make these kind of decisions to scope down and to scope the pie down, but then don't realize necessarily who that is that we're leaving out in that process. And with Google's products, of course, we're serving billions of users across the globe and really, really need to be intentional about what that means then for the experience we're creating. So how does that translate to machine learning? Here is an example of some images classified based on an image recognition classification task. So the idea is we give a machine learning system an image and it classifies it about what the image is about. So if the image is about a baby, it would say, hey, this image has a baby in it. If the image has a bride in it, it would say this has a bride. If the image has food, it might say this is food or pancakes or whatever it is that it is measuring. And here you see 4 pictures of weddings. In the first 3 pictures, you have the image task labeling ceremony, wedding, bride, groom, dress. The last picture, which is a non-Western wedding, is labeled person and people, right? And this is a great example of, again, not a malicious decision, but a question of, well, how did that happen, right? How did we get a system that only recognized certain types of weddings and certain types of images? And we trained the system. We went back and said, okay, what was the training data that trained this classifier? And this particular classifier was trained on a data set called Open Images. It's a pretty popular data set. It's out there in the world for anyone to pick up and use. It's tons of images that were labeled with, these different aspects. But it is mostly, if not only, images from the Western world. And so when you train a system based on mostly images from the Western world, that system isn't going to learn to recognize a wedding that looks different, right? It's not going to learn to recognize a breakfast meal that might look different from another breakfast, or when a profession looks different in one country or one region versus the other. And so a key aspect here has been really for us digesting and understanding what are some of the reasons why these issues can come in, what does that manifest like, and how does that impact our downstream products and experiences, right? For this particular example, it actually motivated us to create a new data set called Open Images Extended, where we actually crowdsourced images from around the world in other parts and other regions to say, hey, can we have a data set that actually more accurately reflects the global distribution of professions, of roles, of people, of cultural events, so that we can actually train based on that. And we found that actually when you use those images and improve training a classifier, you get much more accuracy across images like this last one in terms of being able to represent a more diverse range. And I think that example, as well as the example of the Band-Aid and the seatbelt, and even the examples I showed at the very beginning, are all case studies of these kinds of questions where fairness and bias can get embedded into a system because of our own unconscious biases and our own processes in terms of how we build and develop products. And so when we talk about ML fairness, it's really not just a technical problem, right? It's a problem of the cultural mindset that we bring to the table when we're building products. And we think about that, we like to use the term socio-technical, right? It's about really understanding the underlying history, the underlying cultures, what is the systemic bias that maybe is influencing the systems in our products, right? In the case of that image classification task, yes, it was the data that was skewed in a particular direction, but why was the data skewed? Because of a history of who collected the data, what it was collected for, and where it was collected from. And so I think it's really important that we always bring in a set of stakeholders that can walk back that history, understand where there might be concerns, and bring in that perspective that then affects like the technical and product work that we actually do. So for an ML pipeline in particular, we think about what does that actually mean in terms of where this comes in. The example I showed shows a data set issue. But the reality of the system is throughout an ML pipeline, throughout the way a machine learning system gets developed, human bias can enter every single step of the way. So it starts with whether you're collecting the data, who is collecting the data, where are you collecting the data from, what data did you think you should be collecting, to then labeling the data, right? So who is actually sitting down and saying, yes, this image is of breakfast, right? Who is doing that task, and what instructions were they given, what policies were they using, but also what background and conscious or unconscious biases do they bring to the table. Then you actually choose to train a model, right? And you give the model some sort of goal, right? So you say, hey, I want this model to have the most accuracy possible, or I want this model to do really well on this particular task. So who's deciding what that objective is? How are we training the model, and how are we evaluating its success? Then in a lot of our products, right, we do something with that model. So because of a particular model, maybe you choose to filter out porn and adult content, or because of a model, you may choose to rank one thing higher than another thing. So there's a bunch of stuff that you do then with this data. And then users actually see that effect, and users act in a way that reflects their own biases. They may choose to click on certain things. They may choose to engage with certain things, flag certain things as really awesome or really offensive. And their behavior then informs more of this collection. So at every step of this process, there is the scope for introducing human bias. And I think that means that when we're talking about ML fairness, there isn't a one-stop fix, right? There isn't a one way to make a system better. And in fact, likely different product experiences are going to need different approaches, different ways of addressing them, and different trade-offs in terms of what kind of problem we want to solve and what we define and mean by fairness. Sorry, next slide. So what we've been doing is working on building up a team that combines design, engineering, public policy, social science, to start kind of tackling those sets of questions. Sorry, I have a roti maker that's going on in the background, and it occasionally makes loud, interesting noises. So I apologize for that in advance. But we have this combination of skills that we're trying to bring to the table together, because we're aware of the fact that bias can come in multiple parts, and that also how we choose to address one bias could lead to another, right? How we address one type of awareness could lead to a different one. Many of our products serve many different users at the same time. They serve advertisers, they serve creators, they serve users. What fair means to one community may mean something different to another. And it's important for us to balance those different perspectives every time we're approaching this conversation. And then, therefore, what we're doing is working on kind of three sets of things. We're working on building out a knowledge base, so developing a lot of research, best practices, resources, working on these end-to-end improvements in product to see what we can do. And then also working on trying to actually expand the conversation, right? So share our learnings, get perspectives from external stakeholders and advisors, have conversations with developer communities externally to see what is working with other companies, to try and make sure that this is something that is an overall ecosystem that we're building. And it ends up meaning that we work on this combination of research, product improvements, and then scaling our insights. So what my team has been working on is not just developing out foundational technical and socio-technical research, but then trying to say, okay, how does that apply to, say, a product like image search or others? And then how do we actually scale those insights, right? So when something actually works, when we're able to address a particular type of concern, can we build out tools, resources, data sets, other best practices that make it easier for teams within Google or outside of Google to learn from those experiences, right? Especially because I think the reality is we're all in this together. If we really want to actually build a more inclusive ecosystem, every part of that ecosystem matters, right? The more students who get access to certain opportunities, their use of Google products will differ in a different way. That'll influence the whole ecosystem and the whole system. And so we want to make sure that this is actually something that is industry-wide. So I'll pause there for a second. I don't know, any thoughts, questions, and then I'll walk into some of the lessons that we've learned in some of our products more specifically.
Any questions from anyone? Happy to feel free to unmute yourself or drop in the chat.
Otherwise, I can just keep on going.
Hi, I have a question. My name
Yeah.
is Sean, software engineer here. I was wondering, when you crowdsource your data for like more diverse images of like weddings, for example, how do you ensure that your new data set is not laden with new inherent biases? Like, for example, if you're only asking on the internet, then only people with internet access are going to contribute these pictures.
Yeah, it's actually a really, really good question. And I think the honest answer is there's no such thing as an unbiased data set, right? So there's really no such thing as a data set that doesn't reflect some bias. Maybe it's who's on the internet. When you're crowdsourcing images, it's also who you crowdsourced from, right? So did we crowdsource from a particular country or region? Did we crowdsource across the globe? Who even heard about this task in the first place? So we've been doing two things. I think one is trying to be really intentional about what bias we're trying to solve when we go out and collect data. And then also being really honest with ourselves about what biases are still present. And so we've been really pushing actually a framework within the company called data cards, which is this idea of data accountability. So every time you collect a data set, you should document who collected it, why did you collect it, where did you go to get it, right? What users does that capture and which users does that leave out? What regions maybe does the data cover? And so we've been really trying to think through, how do we make sure that not only are we trying to address bias in data collection, but that we're being really honest about the limitations so that when we use the data set, we're using it appropriately, right? So if we're collecting, for example, a data set that is only reflective of internet users, then we should probably use it wisely in cases where it does reflect the population that we're trying to use it for, but then also recognize like what kind of gaps it may have. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I have a quick question.
I'm curious. Oh, go ahead.
My name is Jason, head of trust and safety here. And I was kind of curious about when you're looking, I know you mentioned talking to external stakeholders as well as internal stakeholders to help inform some of these decisions. When you're looking at external stakeholders, like what are some of those criteria that you're looking at, like organizations that specialize in diversity, or in like, for example, All Tech is Human, which specializes in like ethical tech. Like what kind of things are you doing there? What is part of that decision when you're choosing your external stakeholders?
Yeah, I think one of the important things we've learned with external stakeholder engagement is that it's really contextual, right? In terms of where and when we want to engage with different communities. So I think, the answer is sort of almost all of the above, in that like there are external stakeholders who are academics and who have like really strong expertise in certain types of techniques or technical approaches, right? And so that's really amazing to be able to involve external stakeholders when it comes to some of the academic or foundational research we're doing. We involve stakeholders for particular projects. For example, like YouTube Kids works a lot with experts in children, right? And understanding the kid experience. And so then we would want to work with those experts to understand what we're talking about in the context of that particular experience. And so I think it really depends on what product we're working on, who the users are for that product, and specifically what we want to understand, right? So for example, I was just working on a project with YouTube where we reached out to YouTube creators from diverse communities that represent, the YouTube Black community, the YouTube Pride community, and we wanted to bring in those creators to reflect on and help us understand how to make the creator experience better for diverse creator communities. And so it really depends on, do you want to actually engage the user themselves? Do you want to engage an expert kind of counsel or engagement? I think All Tech is Human is amazing. I've had conversations with them a lot about some of the resources and tools that they're building. And so I think it really just depends on like what the type of engagement is.
Let's go with Michael L.
Hey, my name is Michael. I'm a software engineer here. Nobody important, but sorry if you answered this question already. So I know you like briefly said what's fair in one community might not be fair in another community. And so I was just wondering, like, can a community technically be like one person? Like when does an amount of people become a community, and like how does that like get weighted, like if somebody thinks that one thing is fair and then they think it's fair for them, but then another community is like, oh, actually I don't think that's fair for them. Like,
yeah, that's a really, really great question. So I will say this is one that is particularly hard, and I think the like broad answer I would give is, ideally what we want is a fair experience for every individual user, right? Like ideally what we want is for every user to be able to come to a particular product or experience and have a good experience, be included in the experience, depending on what the experience is, maybe see themselves in the experience. So that I think is the ideal state. And then I think the question is, okay, how do you get there, right? And what does that look like? And I think there's two parts to that. One is how you go about designing the experience. And so when we're designing the experience, I think you want to make sure that you have a diversity of users that you do user research with, that you're collecting data from a diversity of users. And when we talk about communities in that context, I think we often start with, the US legal system and say, okay, what are protected classes in the United States? What is one way of, at least for the US cohort, how do we think about that? But then again, the communities we think about, let's say in India, are likely going to be different than the communities that we kind of think about here in the United States when we're talking about that kind of diversity. And so we try to make sure that, it's a broad range, that, and then also that the design principles that we're following theoretically work for a broad range of users, right? And then there's a question then of like, how do you measure whether or not you're doing things the right way? And that often requires you to make hard choices about like what you're going to measure, what community you're going to measure for. And I think actually from a privacy perspective, we try to be really crisp about making sure that we're not isolating out individual users, but are actually only measuring when we have enough data to actually look at a broader set, so that we're being really careful both about like the trade-offs between privacy and making sure that we're evaluating on a more sliced approach.
Okay, thank you. I thought as much.
Yeah.
And Tulsee, I don't know how we're doing on time. Maybe one more question and then.
Yeah, one more question and then I can kind of keep going.
I think Ben J here put himself in line. So go for it, Ben.
Well, so I was just curious, we were talking about like understanding that, all data sets are biased to some degree, and that the task is to try to move towards everybody get like some sort of equity there. I'm curious if there's any push towards like the transparency of the state of any given ML product, like allowing end users to know, how biased the data they're currently using for the product is, or whether there's an assumption that, the ML is always getting better, but we're not explicitly sharing what the current state of the bias is.
Yeah, so I don't know how familiar all of you are, but the EU actually just released a draft set of regulation, I think earlier this week, or maybe it was last week. I'm losing track of time over here. But the EU regulation, actually one of the explicit things it pushes for is transparency. And that's one of the actual really, really key points that we want to make sure is something that we're building in. I think the question becomes like, what is good transparency and what does that actually look like, right? I think we've developed a framework that we call model cards, in addition to this idea of data cards I talked about earlier, which actually came from some of the research done by Google researchers, which is this idea of a transparency artifact that really explicitly talks about the state of the model. So like, what is the version? How well is the model performing? What is it used for? What are some of the limitations of the model? And actually showcasing some of those metrics. And that's actually something we've even tested out through Google Cloud. So for some of our models in Google Cloud, we've actually released model cards that explicitly say, like, here's the current state of the model, here's how it's performing. I think that model card is more effective probably for a developer audience or a community, or like an audience that actually really aware and familiar with things like, what does accuracy mean when we're measuring it, right? Or like, what is precision recall and what is a precision recall curve? And so I think an open still question is, what is the right level of granularity and transparency to give to an end user who may not have that technical context? Like, is it helpful to give you a graph that has all these numbers? Or do we want to provide something a little bit more abstract? What is most effective for that user audience, and what kind of controls do we want to give them? And so I think that's still an open area of research in terms of like, how do we want to navigate some of the developer transparency towards user transparency?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you for that.
Cool. Tulsee, I'll let you move on. Angie, I see your question, but maybe we can cover that towards the end. So
yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to walk through some of this, and then we can come back to that question and others in the time we have left. So 3 things that I just wanted to kind of jump through, and what I'll do is talk through them through case studies. Some of them we've actually already talked through in these questions, so it'll actually be easy to kind of jump through. So the first one is thinking about data. And the reason I break these actually down into data, measurement, and modeling and design is because as I talked about earlier, there isn't like a one size fits all solution to dealing with fairness concerns. And so what I thought would be helpful is to talk through like 3 different case studies of how we've thought about fairness concerns in different products, and what that's actually meant in terms of how we've gone about addressing them. And I will say, like, addressing them is not the same as solving them, right? I think there's still a lot of work left to go, but I think at least it helps in kind of some of that work. So let's talk about data first. So I love this example. It's kind of similar a little bit in its flavor to the images example I gave earlier, but this is an example from a product called Google Quick Draw, where we released a product that would be this Pictionary game. And the idea was that a model would essentially learn how to guess an example that you drew. So if I draw a shoe, then a model would guess that this is a shoe. And then it would actually serve as training data. So the thing that I drew would go into the model, would train the model to learn what a shoe is, and would make it better at playing Pictionary with other users. And we found that over time, what the model was able to do was learn that a shoe looked somewhat like the blue shoe. Like, it looked a little bit like this kind of sneaker Converse type thing, but that the model was really bad at recognizing heels, and that it actually couldn't tell that a heel was a shoe. And a large part of this was because when you ask a user to draw a shoe, most users were drawing something that looked like these blue things. It was maybe easier to draw, or maybe more of the default behavior, and less users were actually drawing heels. And so over time, because the model just didn't have that data to learn from, it didn't actually pick that up. And there's a bunch of things here, right? Who actually played Quick Draw, and what were the demographics of those users? What did they consider shoes? Honestly, just what is easier to draw, right? And what kind of bias does that lead into terms of what the model learns? Where was this game being played, and what do shoes look like in different regions or countries? This is also something that we see affecting even our products that are used every day by users, right? This is the Nest Hub Max. The Nest Hub Max has face unlock. So if you walk in front of it, it tries to recognize who you are and wants to unlock. And a key part for us was making sure that that works for every single user, right? And that just because you have a different skin tone, or maybe a different gender presentation, because you're older or younger, because you're wearing makeup, right? The system should still work for you. And what we found is that collecting data to make this work was incredibly important. And we actually had to make sure that we were collecting data across different lighting conditions and different home settings, that we were collecting data across different skin tones, and being really, really careful about what that looks like. And this gets to the question that Sean asked earlier about, there's no such thing as an unbiased data set. So it's really important for us to make sure that we were collecting data and testing on that data across as diverse a set of user base as we could. And some of the things that we've learned in the process, right? One is, make sure you're building training and eval data sets that represent all the nuances of your target population. So for example, lighting condition is one that isn't necessarily a demographic group, but is something that can affect certain types of homes, certain users, certain environments more than others, right? And we want to be careful that when you're thinking about training an eval data set, what are all the nuances that may affect a user's experience? And how can you account for that in the data you're collecting? The other piece is who your target population might leave out. So if you're choosing to collect data in California, for example, and you're going to go and get data from different users, what does that mean for the experiences that you're not collecting? What is that data looking like? What are you leaving out? The other piece that's always really important to think about is how will your data grow and change over time, right? No product is static. And as the world changes, the kind of data the way that users use your product will change over time, right? So we've seen even just with the Nest Hub, the way that people have used the product adapts in coronavirus, right? And in the way that you exist in the pandemic. And so how do you make sure that the training data you're collecting and the approach that you're taking to collect data adapts with how different environments, different communities, different people may choose to use the product? The second piece is really around thinking about measurement and modeling, right? And the actual ML itself. And I think when we talk about ML fairness and we talk about products, we often focus on the data because it is such a critical part of the experience that we're creating. But it's also really important to make sure that throughout your modeling experience, we're setting things up appropriately and setting things up in the right way. And different fairness concerns may require different metrics. And I think it's also worth calling out that single products may have multiple different fairness concerns, right? So for example, 2 things that we talk about are often disproportionate performance and what we call representational harms. So a disproportionate performance could be when a product just doesn't work as well for one set of users as it does for another. Maybe it has like higher error rates, or in the case of, you know, like an image classification task, maybe the classification test just doesn't work for some images versus another, right? So here you, for example, see that like in one image, it's actually able to recognize the person where it's not able to in the second image. A representational harm is often a harm that gets placed based on stereotypes, based on the kind of way that the model behaves in the context of the product. So it may not necessarily be leaving you out of an experience, but the way that these errors are manifesting may still cause significant harm in terms of the overall experience, right? And these aren't the same problem, and they don't have the same metrics, and they don't manifest in the same way. And so it's important every time you look at a product and say, okay, how can I make this product more inclusive? How can I make it more fair? To ask the question of like, what are the different ways in which this product could be unfair? And what are the different ways in which it could affect my users? And am I measuring for each of those things? So just to bring that into a tactical example, this is one of Google's products. It is the Jigsaw toxicity API. And the goal of this product was to help, or is actually to help moderate online conversations. So you can basically take a given comment online and it'll classify it on a scale of 0 to 1. Where 0 is, this is definitely not a toxic comment. It's very nice and very friendly. And 1 is, this is a really hateful, awful, offensive thing to say, right? So if I said something like, I love puppies, they're my best friends, that would probably get a 0. And then if I said like, I hate puppies, they're awful and terrible, and why do they exist? That would probably get a 1.0. And so you're kind of trying to classify things on that scale. And when this initially released in 2017, the team thought it would be a great idea to create a UI widget to allow users to play with this and help them understand, you know, what is toxic, what is not toxic, also test out the classifier, see how well it was working. And a user tried these 2 sentences, I am straight and I am gay. And the sentence I am straight got a score of 0.04, so extremely non-toxic, whereas the sentence I am gay got a score of 0.86. Very close to 1, very close to highly toxic, right? And this is absolutely not an experience we want our products to be perpetuating, right? This is hurtful. It is a problem for so many different reasons. And the fact is we didn't catch it when this model initially released in 2017. And we wouldn't have wanted this to be something that a user has to discover, right? We want it to be something that's part of our process, that is something that we identified, detected, and improved. And so we started by saying like, okay, what are the different types of harms that this is causing, right? One is this idea of comparison, counterfactual differences. So how would the prediction change if the identity token was something else? So for example, what is the difference in the prediction between the sentence, I am gay, I am queer, I am Muslim, I am Jewish, I am straight, I'm Christian? And you can see that the scores, when we were looking at this initial model, vary differently across these identity terms, which is not an experience we wanted to see happen, right? For the same sentence, a single user should not feel like we're making a judgment call on one community versus another. Quite frankly, we shouldn't be, right? Between one community and another. And so we started saying like, okay, let's actually measure that. But we also wanted to measure another problem, which was just disproportionate performance. What is overall errors for each group? So for example, for sentences containing the word gay, not just the sentence I am gay, but a broader range of sentences that might be used in online dialogue and conversation, what are the overall error rates? How often do we get it wrong? How often do we classify something as toxic when it's not? How often do we also classify something as not toxic when it is? Right? We want to make sure that we capture things in both directions. And so the darker the color here on the scale, the higher the error rate was when we had this initial first model. And so you can see that the error rates for certain terms were significantly higher than the error rates for others. And that was just an overall flag that not just should we be thinking about a single term switching within the results, but that we should also be thinking about these groups overall. And so then the question became, okay, how can we actually improve our models? If our models are performing in this way, what can we do to make it better? And we've been working on a lot of research at Google, not just in terms of what are the best approaches, but also what can we do that works in a way that is resource efficient, that is stable, that we can scale to more models. So can we balance like simplicity of implementation with accuracy, quality, and of course the experience we eventually want to provide to our users. And so, you know, the simplest thing that you can do when you think about this like Jigsaw example is to say, well, I'm just going to actually remove the term. I don't even want the model to know the identity, right? So I'm actually going to take the sentence, some people are Indian, and I'm going to replace every word Indian with the word identity. And I'm going to just say, well, I'm going to train the model to be essentially agnostic to any community. And I'm going to treat all of these sentences like they're exactly the same. that has certain benefits, right? And it is an approach that is actually relatively straightforward to implement. And in that case, you would see that all sentences that looked the same way, that had these identity terms, would be roughly treated the same way. The issue, though, is that communities aren't talked about the same way online, right? Certain communities do experience more hate and harassment. Certain communities are often talked about in certain ways. Certain sentence framings are different for different communities. And so we really wanted to make sure that that is also accounted for. And unfortunately, if you remove these terms altogether, the model isn't able to discriminate between them, but the model is also not able to treat them differently, right? And it's not able to identify the cases in which it should be treating a particular community differently because the experience is particularly more harmful or more problematic for one group. Another approach we've done, and this is in fact what we did for the Jigsaw classifier, was pursue active sampling and data collection. So enabling your model to sample data from the areas in which your model seems to be underperforming. Go get more data that represents the areas where you're seeing high error rates so that you can make the model perform better. And we also actually went out actively to pride parades across the globe and collected sentences of people talking about their communities, because we wanted to collect a lot of positive examples to counteract some of the negative examples we were seeing in the initial data we had collected, to make sure that there was a more representative set of, positive comments that contain certain identity terms, as well as neutral comments, as well as negative comments. There's also just like fancier things you can do, right? Depending on the capacity that you have in terms of training your model, as well as like how complicated the task is, you may also actually just want to update the model altogether. And so you may want to say, hey, my model has this objective function. It has this thing it's trying to accomplish. Well, I'm also going to update the model's understanding of what it should be trying to accomplish to minimize the difference in performance between different groups. And I want my model to also recognize that not only should it get this task right, it should get this task right without performing differently for different communities or types of content or whatever the difference is that I want. And so we're also able to use modeling techniques to improve the performance of the model and actually make the downstream impacts better. And we've been able to see with the toxicity classifier that doing these things can actually make things significantly better, right? So you see the example from V1, which launched in 2017, to V6, which launched in late 2019. And you can see the significant improvements that we're able to make by just actually trying some of these techniques and being more intentional. And I think the key part for me here too is that measurement here was so key, right? It was key to motivating the team. To having the team feel like, oh, there's a thing that I can move. Like I have a number and I can track my progress. I can make things better. I can get to a point where I can see a meaningful difference in the user experience. It also allows us to hold ourselves accountable, right? And to make sure that we're making the right changes and that we're doing that over time. And so for us, one of the key parts of the product inclusion and the ML fairness experiences has been really setting metrics at granular levels, at broader levels, and holding ourselves accountable to those metrics moving. It is worth noting, though, that your metric is also susceptible to the thing that you evaluate it on, right? So these two evaluations were done over a synthetic data set. So we basically created a bunch of examples of sentences that had different identity terms and then evaluated how well our models were performing on those sentences that we created. But the online conversation often looks very different than synthetic examples or made up examples that we would create. And we found actually that evaluating the model on real world examples of the conversation online can actually lead to different results in terms of how these numbers look. And so we've also been very conscious to make sure that we're evaluating these metrics not just once, but even on different types of data sets to reflect the kinds of differences we might want to see and making sure that the experience is actually effective for users online. So some of the lessons also that I would want to make sure we highlight as a part of that experience is one, testing, right? Testing and actually evaluating your system for all of these different communities, for different identity terms, for different types of images or cultures is so important, right? Because we wouldn't have known, I mean, we didn't when we released the product in 2017, that we were going to see these types of examples. And had we set up this framework before we had launched at all, we may have actually caught this example and ended up with a product that was much more equitable, much more fair for different users. The other piece is make sure you develop multiple metrics, right? There isn't a single metric that is going to solve the problem. There is likely not a single metric even just for a single community, but there's also different communities. They experience things in different ways, to Michael's question earlier. And I think we want to make sure that you have metrics that reflect the diversity of experiences that you're trying to create. And the last piece is that it is possible to take proactive steps when you're designing a model to actually make it work more effectively for diverse data sets. And I think the more that you test and set up those metrics, the more you can create that feedback loop, even just in the technical implementation itself, to make it work more effectively. And I'll quickly go through this last lesson, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions, which is around design. So what I talked about, when I talked both about data and the model, it's very technical, right? It's very focused on like the process of actually building that model, training that model, evaluating that model. But the reality is a product is usually way, way more than a model, right? Usually the model is one input to a broader product experience that wraps around the model that the user actually engages with and sees. And so when we think about what does it actually mean to build a fair and inclusive experience, it's often not just about the model or even about the model. It's about the overall experience that the user has. So an example here that I'll use for motivation is Google Translate. And this is one that many of you may have seen before. This is an example of translating Turkish to English. And Turkish doesn't have gendered pronouns. And so these sentences would translate to this person is a nurse and this person is a doctor. But when we ran this with Google Translate, you see that it translates to she is a nurse and he is a doctor, right? And so you have this implicit bias, this implicit representational harm in the way that we are translating gendered stereotypes into our product, right? And again, not an experience we want to create, not something we want to keep perpetuating in terms of gender roles and professions. So the question becomes, okay, how do we fix that? What does the right answer look like for this example? And we've been thinking a lot about, how do we make our model better? How do we collect better data? How do we improve that? And in fact, actually, the Translate team has done a lot of work to make the models better and to make them more accurate. But the other thing we started thinking about was, what is the overall user experience here? And how do we make for a more effective design in terms of the way that a user would experience this product? For example, let's take the sentence, Casey is my friend, right? If I want to translate that into Spanish, and Spanish has terms that are gendered, the question is, how do I do that? How do I know if Casey is a male friend, is a female friend, or is a non-gender binary friend? And how do I decide what translation is the most effective? What does an accurate translation for the sentence mean? And so we actually decided to take a more design approach to this problem and say, hey, in some cases, the user actually has more information than we do, right? And the user can actually give us more context in terms of what they're actually trying to achieve. So I can take the word friend, for example, and translate it into Spanish, giving it both the masculine and the feminine options, right? So you can choose whether or not you want to translate friend to amigo or whether you want to translate friend to amiga. And that puts more control and more opportunity in the hands of the user. So yes, we need to make our models better. Yes, we need to make them more accurate, but it also allows the opportunity for the user to actually engage with this experience and to provide context that they uniquely have when we're going between, especially in this case, languages that have different expectations. And so a key part there is that context is really, really key, right? The way that a user chooses to engage with a product is going to make a big difference. What background you're coming from, what you're trying to achieve, whether, for example, you understand the language or not, right? Most people who use Google Translate don't understand the language that they're translating into. That's why they're using Google Translate. And so it's really important actually that we not provide something obscure, but actually give the user context on like, oh, you can translate it in two ways. One way is masculine, one way is feminine. Which way would you like to use it, right? And then to give them that context. We've also learned that really making sure we get feedback from diverse users is hugely critical, right? If someone hadn't tried the product in Turkish and hadn't tried these sentences in Turkish, we may not have known that that was a concern that we would see, right? Different users who speak different languages will give us that kind of feedback. Different users who are sensitive to different types of conversations will give us that feedback. And so making sure that you're getting feedback as you're developing the product, but also that you actually have feedback channels when your product is live as well. What are ways for users to tell you that the experience isn't working for them? What are ways for them to tell you it's broken? What are ways for them to tell you that they would have recommended something differently or that it was offensive or harmful? The last piece is, how do you identify ways to enable multiple experiences, right? No single user is going to come to your product with the same expectation. And so, for example, a user who understands both languages, but is testing Google Translate or trying to come up with a specific a specific term is a different user than a user who doesn't understand the second language and is looking for a conversation with someone who maybe they don't otherwise who maybe they couldn't otherwise converse with, right? And so understanding the different types of users who might be coming to your product and how they would want to engage with the product and what your product can do to support that also becomes really critical, because the way that a fairness or bias or inclusion concern can manifest would be different based on that, right? So it all really comes down to, with this last kind of theme, is, are you centering your user, right? And all of us as product builders, designers, product managers, engineers are really focused on trying to build user first experiences. And this, I think, is really about how can we make sure that no matter what we're building in terms of the data and the model, that the experience itself lends itself to one where users can actually engage, that there's transparency with users, that users have controls, that users can give feedback, that there are guardrails. And all of that is especially critical in a machine learning type product where there's a black box involved and can feel really unnerving or really harmful if you don't actually have that ability to engage. I'll stop there. I know we only have about 7 minutes left, so maybe what we'll do is take questions. I had one more section around actual tools that are available. And one thing I'll just flag is if you are a machine learning practitioner, we do have a lot of very tactical tools that can help you with evaluating data sets across distributions, evaluating your model. We have tools that can help you create transparency documentation for your model, every version of your model, so that it can update with how that model is performing and create a nice friendly UI that is easy to parse and read. So if you're interested, you can just go to tensorflow.org/responsibleai. Many of these tools also work for non-TensorFlow models, so they're not necessarily restricted. We also have tools for explainability that can help you debug in a model and help you understand why it's performing the way it is. So if we have time and there aren't any questions, I'm happy to go through this section, but I just wanted to flag that I think it's more fun often to do discussion. So I'll stop there and we can go from there.
Thanks, Tulsee. I wanna revisit Angie's question. I don't know if you have any data, but were you able to improve the issue with the cute babies, as the anecdote that I alluded to at the beginning of this presentation?
Yeah, so if you go to image search and you search for cute babies, you will still see a pretty homogeneous set of results. It is something we are actively working on in terms of trying to improve. And I think part of the challenge is we're trying to make sure we improve it in a way that is equitable, right? We want to be conscious of how do we make sure we improve across a diverse set of users. What do we want that diversity to look like? So I'm hoping there will be more to share over the next year in terms of making progress on that set of results. It is something that is very much top of mind, and maybe I can even come back and talk more about it once we have more that I can share.
Great. And Michael, that's okay. You are asking another question. Feel free to ask another one. Go for it, sir.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just about to hit the raise hand button, Kelsey. My bad. My question is pretty simple this time. I was just wondering if there is a certain amount of like adversity that we are protecting a user from that like may end up being like beneficial to them from a like psychological standpoint or like a psychoanalysis standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and one that honestly, I don't know that I have a good answer to. I think any adversity, I'm sure, is a growing experience and is one that we also want to make sure that even for something, for example, in the case of search, we want to make sure that you see the breadth of results that exist on the web, right? And we don't want to hide certain realities of the way people talk about certain events or communities. We want to make sure that all of that gets seen. I think one of the things that we're really conscious of, though, is I don't think we want our products to cause, I think often the kind of harms that you see with ML fairness are sitting on top of harms that communities are already facing, on top of adversity that communities are already facing, right? Because it is taking that adversity that's happening in the real world and bringing it in through training data, through experiences, through unconscious biases into the web and into these online experiences. And so I like to think, at least, that we have more of a responsibility to prevent that adversity in our systems and our products, because we want to make sure that users have a safe space to engage online, right? And I think that's definitely a balance in terms of when do you want to showcase the world of information versus when do you want to make sure that users have that safe space.
We have a question from Christopher here. Just raised his hand. Thanks.
Yeah, this is probably not a question for Tulsee, but I'd be happy to maybe talk in the leadership AMA on Fridays about how we plan to apply some of these awesome learnings and best practices internally at Handshake. So just wanted to elevate that, even though it's not really a Tulsee question.
Yeah, that's awesome. And actually, I will say too, as you start to have those conversations, if there's anything I can do to help or even connecting resources and things like that, obviously Asif already has my info, but feel free to reach out. Would love to have that conversation.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks for asking. Ben here has a question. Ben, I can read this, or why don't you verbally read your question, or if you want to expound on that.
Yeah, so my question was, like, when you're developing a model or for a feature you're not going to build, is there ever a point when you find the biases within it and then you're like, we can't build this feature at all, or like there's too many edge cases that we don't know about, or that like maybe we shouldn't be building this at all? Like, does that ever come up?
Yeah, there's actually this great case study. I'll try and find the link and I'll send it through as well, which is around our text to speech functionality. And so we have in Google, we have an AI principles review process. And so for those 7 AI principles that I presented at the beginning, we actually ask teams to go through a review before they launch to see if they meet certain criteria. And as a part of that process, we also have these conversations about, like, should we be launching this at all, right? Like, and does this even make sense? Is it something we're willing to support? And what we found when we were looking at text to speech is that there are a number of harms if you're not careful enough about the way that kind of a system could be used, especially if you just open source the text to speech functionality with like no particular use case, right? Because then someone can take that functionality and use it for any use case that they want to downstream. And so we went through a bunch of reviews, we went through a bunch of evaluations, and we eventually decided actually that we don't want to launch it that way. We only want to launch it in specific applications where it's already been built, where we can already evaluate that specific application internally, and then put that out in the world. And so that's, I think, just like one example. But I would say, like, for a number of our systems, it's sometimes a case where we decide, like, text to speech, we just don't want to do this at all. Like, we're not comfortable, we don't want to launch it. Sometimes it takes the form of, hey, we can't launch this now. We need to actually make this better. We need to mitigate these concerns. And then we're comfortable launching it. And it goes through this like cyclical process. Maybe it takes longer to launch the product, but I think we're a lot prouder of what we launch at the end.
I think we have one last question. Ashish, you wanna read it out loud here?
Yeah, sure. You were talking about I forgot, I think it was 2 sections ago, about like identifying some of the nuances, and you gave examples like changing the lighting for the nest and those kinds of things. I guess, like, outside of having maybe a diverse set of people like thinking about this, are there just like practical tips about, especially the more like non-obvious types of nuances that you need to identify? Is that
yeah, I wish I had a great answer to it. I mean, I'll be honest that I feel like for myself, a lot of it has just come from practical experience, right? And from seeing and being able to translate from one example to another, right? So being able to take from certain image and face like detection recognition applications and saying, okay, what are things we've learned from those, and like how do we make sure we codify those learnings so that we look at them again, the next time around. And I think the reason that the diverse user piece is nice is because in putting like that device, for example, in different houses, you'll get that experience, like the nuances sort of brought first and foremost to you already. One thing I think that's in general helpful, though, is to do an exercise of sitting down with even just the team in like a war room type session and saying, like, okay, what are all the things that could break this product, right? And what you'll do by just getting everyone in a room, quite frankly, is come up with people brainstorming all kinds of things that you might want to look into, some which you'll never look into because they're not maybe real concerns with the system or there are other reasons, but somewhere you're like, oh yeah, that might be just a good thing to test out. Maybe we should look. And so we found doing even just bringing together a bunch of people for like an hour and a half to stress test and vet has been huge in being able to uncover things that maybe someone would have thought of, but that I wouldn't have if I was just like sitting on my own.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Well, all right, we are at time. So if everyone can just blow up the chat, thanking Tulsee for giving this talk today. Super informative. I'm super glad that you gave us the time today, and super grateful. Super important too that we have awesome minds like you working at super important companies like Google, working on these types of problems and helping educate us. So really appreciate it, Tulsee. Thank you so much. And,
yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and we will provide the recording via email, Slack, in case you missed part of this, or recommend it to all your coworkers. And thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Tulsee. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Talk soon.